Arcades were a place that would pay you in toys to play their games. What a concept. Hey, wait a second. Isn't that just legal casinos for children? What the fuck? I spent a lot of time in arcades growing up, whether it was standalone or attached to a mall, movie theater, or bowling alley. You'd probably see me there. There was just something about the environment that spoke to me. The loudness, the flashing colors, the other excited kids, and the hundreds of tickets pouring out of machines. It was intoxicating. I had my love for arcades restored on a recent trip to Japan a couple of years ago, where I was exposed to their dozens and dozens of arcades on just about every street corner. They just never died out over there. By the way, this? Yeah, that's an arcade in Kawasaki. I spent like 14 hours straight in that building, and I bet you're sold already. I'm not gonna go too into detail here, but I will say that playing Street Fighter against a bunch of chain-smoking Japanese businessmen as they sit right next to you is one of the most fun experiences I've had in years, so set some time aside for that if you visit. And subscribe if you're interested in me going more into detail on those stories in a future video. But for now, join me as I talk about my experiences going to arcades growing up in the 90s. Let's get to it. I grew up in a relatively janky town, so I don't know if this is going to be true for your local arcades, but there was always like 20 cool new games and 3 horrible old ones from the 70s that nobody played anymore. This was more typical to like local style arcades and not the big chains that could afford to just shove new games in there whenever they felt like it. They seemed to always be old redemption style games like an outdated version of pinball or skee-ball, but occasionally there would be fucking bangers like this. Yeah. Pretty cool. It's a baseball game, and there would never be a line, so I played the hell out of that thing. There would also occasionally be a super old grungy light gun shooting gallery, and there's actually still one to this day in the Midway Arcade on Clifton Hill in Niagara Falls. These, of course, were the games where you'd like shoot a sensor and it would play a wacky sound effect or start rapidly spinning around to indicate a hit. And these things worked about as well as Duck Hunt, if that tells you anything. My dad actually told me stories about going to the Grand River Shopping Center with my grandparents and being given a handful of nickels and dimes to play those things. He's old. God damn. By the time he was taking me to arcades himself, that price had certainly upgraded, because in the 90s, I remember the odd game costing up to like $2 to play, or a toonie if you're cultured. It's really interesting to me that the origin of arcades were those ticket/redemption games that I mentioned. Video games created the golden era for arcades in the early 80s, but the invention of the home console means that those ticket games are the only thing keeping modern arcades alive at this point. First in, last out. Hey, it was a transition all along. While on the topic, let's talk more about these things. I'm sure you could guess their origins without me having to tell you, but they used to spit out money when you would win, and they very quickly got banned in several states for, well, directly being gambling. Manufacturers tried to make the argument that they were skill-based games and not games of chance, but pinball machines at the time didn't even have flippers yet, so they didn't really have a leg to stand on. The natural progression? Add flippers and make the machines give out tickets instead of legal tender. It was genius. This is definitely not my favorite kind of arcade in the modern day, but as a kid, I absolutely loved the adrenaline. And now that I think about it, that's kind of a fucked up statement. This is, of course, the Chuck E. Cheese business model. Getting kids hopelessly and horribly addicted to your tickets while you feed them delicious pizza. This racket was headed by one infamous kingpin.
A powerful rat named Charles Entertainment Cheese.
Sure, Chuck E. Cheese had the odd video game, but that's not what that place was about. It was about gambling babies. Oh, and creepy animatronics, I guess, but that's less important. I think my mom actually still has a bunch of tokens from there that I was hopelessly hoarding during the height of my addiction. Oops. There were the classic ticket games like Skee Ball, as we already mentioned, but my memories tend to attach themselves to machines like Wheel of Fortune or the Coin Pushers, and my favorite, for reasons I'm about to explain, the ski jump. You see, in one of my local arcades, the one that was attached to the now defunct Sports World if you grew up near me, there was a broken ski jump machine. The way this game was supposed to work was you drop in a token, it would go down this ramp, shoot off towards a rotating wheel that had a bunch of slots cut into it. There was a 5-ticket slot, a 10-ticket slot, a 15-ticket slot, and of course, a jackpot slot. And the jackpot slot was incredibly thin. And if you missed and didn't get it into any of the slots, then you were left with nothing. However, this machine was broken in such a way that when you would miss, it would still spit out dozens and dozens of tickets. I have no clue why they never fixed this, because every single time I went, I abused the hell out of that glitch. I discovered that on one of my first trips, and it never changed over the next several years. Maybe that's why they're out of business now. They went bankrupt from getting their prize inventory of plastic rings and giant teddy bears absolutely swept out from under them. At the end of an afternoon, when you were finished burning through all your parents' money, you'd scour the floors for any errant lost tickets to add to your ever-growing collection. And when you were finished with that, you'd take your tangled mess that's dozens of feet long to one of the ticket counting machines, and my God, this is one of the only things I miss about redemption games. There was just something so satisfying about slowly feeding your tickets into the machine and watching the LCD display as your ticket count slowly climbs from single digits to double digits and then to triple digits. I'm talking about this like I'm a drug addict. Jesus Christ. I don't really miss the prizes though, so that's kind of weird. Now it's time for the main event of the evening. My bread and butter going to arcades growing up. And based on my demographic, I'm sure it's yours too. The video games. There was a massive arcade a couple of hours away from where I grew up called Palladium. And that was the memory of a lifetime the couple of times my dad took me there. But that's not where most of my stories take place. Most of my stories take place in entertainment centers, malls, and movie theaters. There was nothing quite like lining up at the cabinet of a fighting game with a bunch of other kids and battling to the death and exchanging random tips and tricks, most of which were not real things. When you got to the front of the line, you'd stack your tokens to indicate how long you intended to play, either to the happiness or groans of the other kids, depending on how rich your parents were. My favorites in the fighting genre were Marvel vs. Capcom, Mortal Kombat, WrestleFest, and Street Fighter, in that order. One of my fondest arcade memories is going to the Brantford Mall with my dad and forcing him to take me to the arcade there so I could play Marvel vs. Capcom, and only Marvel vs. Capcom for as long as he would let me, every single time we went. Those machines were incredibly rare in my city. I think that was the only arcade that had one, and I was a huge fan of the 90's Spider-Man cartoon, so it was a real treat to go there. Spider-Man was obviously my lead, and I'd use a combination of a couple of other characters to fill out the rest of my team, but I think that Strider and Wolverine were the staples. Another solid genre were the side-scrolling beat-em-up games. My favorites included Turtles in Time, The Simpsons game, and Rampage, which was a unique take on the format. There was just something satisfying about punching the shit out of buildings and then eating people. Oh, by the way, I didn't have an SNES until I was older, but my friend did, and he had a copy of Turtles in Time, and he knew it was my favorite game, but he'd never let me play it. What a dick. Then there were the sports games, and I wasn't as big on these, but I will say that The Simpsons Bowling is one of the best arcade games of all time. It transcends the genre. Getting turkey after turkey on the Disney cruise satisfied me to no end. What a deep cut of a game. I know NBA Jam was also solid, but I sadly never saw one of those machines in person. But I did play a hell of a lot of hang time for the N64, so I'm sure I would have loved it, and I'm gonna include it. There were also the weird golf games with the trackball that you'd absolutely knock into next week, but those were like never in arcades, they were always in family restaurants. That's kind of weird. That brings us to our final genre, racing games. And we both know which one I'm gonna tell you is the best, so let's just say it together. Ready? Crazy Taxi. Just kidding, bitch. It was Cruisin' USA, but you knew that. There's nothing quite like the sound of that theme song blaring over the speakers while you try to adjust the seat for your little ass legs. There were also the motorcycle riding games, but those fucking suck, so forget about them. Cruisin' USA was a game I eventually got for my N64, which was my first exposure to the downfall of arcades. It was the early 2000s by this point, and I realized that the majority of these things that I love to play, I could play at home.
It was kinda over.
Nowadays, arcades in North America have devolved into a couple of chains where adults can go and get trashed. I guess I'm okay with that, but I do feel a little bad for the kids that are never going to get to experience the glory that we did firsthand. As long as there's still the odd place for me to go and nostalgically drop some coin and kick some ass at fighting games, I'm happy. Even if the guy I'm beating smells like stale beer and cigarettes. A win is a win. That's it. That's the end of the video. Thank you for watching. Like, comment, and subscribe, or I'll tell your dad you were mean to me at school last week. If you had a good time, keep it going, and watch that video too. Bye-bye.